Thank you very much for your attention. It's the last talk of the day. I hope you still keep your eyes open with this technology that we've been developing here at UL. Now, we've been working on this over the past 2-3 years as part of a project funded by Enterprise Ireland, which is due to finish by the end of this year. That's CM Nano, continuous manufacturing of drug nanoparticles. It kind of built from the work that we did in SSPC phase 1 up to 2018, and then we build on that through this project. It got the Innovation of the Year award this year in May or April at the Pharma Industry Awards. So it was good to see this being recognized at that stage. So it really starts with this coming issue within the pharma industry, which is the new chemical entities, new APIs are getting increasingly more complex. And becoming more complex, that means that the APIs are getting less water soluble. And that means that bioavailability will be impacted negatively. So as you can see over the years, new chemical entities coming from the industry pipelines, they are mostly water insoluble. Up to 70 or 90% of those BCS class 2 and class 4 drugs are very, very insoluble. And that means that pharma companies, they have to look into ways to formulate the API in a certain way to improve the solubility and the permeability as well to reach the desired pharmacokinetic effect. And there are different ways on how to do this, formulating the API through amorphous dispersions or liposomes and so on. One of the popular techniques is doing particle size reduction, and particularly using top-down techniques, which is using milling, breaking down large particles into finer particles within the micron size or down to nanosize range. So that has been very successful within the industry. Top-down methods such as, I think I have a laser here, such as high-pressure homogenization, also known as microfluidisation. It's a wet milling technique where you break down the particles further and further down to the nanosize range. And then you end up with a nanosuspension. So your API is broken down into fine particles. And there are also other wet milling techniques as well. For those who want to stay in the micron size range, there's jet milling, a few other techniques, ball milling as well, to reduce the particles, but down to the micron size range. Now, bottom-up techniques are much more interesting to do this. There is a range of bottom-up techniques that are used in a single-step way or a multi-step way to produce nano-sized particles, dry nano-sized particles. For instance, spray drying has been used very well in the industry where nanoparticles are produced through microfluidisation. So particles are broken down into fine nano-sized particles. And then this nanosuspension is sprayed through a spray dryer. Adding a polymer there, so the polymer is dissolved, but the API is suspended. You end up, after spray drying, with a nanoformulation, which is micron-sized particles composed of a polymer. Within the polymer granules, you have nano-sized particles. So that's a two-step approach, right? Using spray drying as a multi-step approach to producing nano-sized particles. Or you can use a one-step approach, which is not spray drying, but nano-spray drying, right? For instance, nano-spray drying, there are a few equipments being sold by vendors like the Buki nanospray drying B90, and they produce small nano-sized particles. They typically are amorphous. There's not much control in terms of the solid state. It works well, but then scaling up, it's a challenge. And particularly, it's a challenge the way that those nanoparticles are being collected after they are dried. So you can produce nanoparticles, but then how can you isolate nanoparticles if you want to end up with with an oral-based final product, like a tablet or a capsule or whatever it is. So supercritical fluid techniques have been very popular in the 90s and so on. But after that, the interest kind of fade off because those techniques, they are based on high pressure, highly pressurized drying chambers. And that means that when you want to scale up a process and you have to increase the scale, that causes safety concerns, scalability issues, and so on. So that's how we took those issues in terms of the challenge, in terms of isolating nanoparticles in a spray drying method and using supercritical CO2 as well without requiring the need for highly pressurized drying chambers. So we had a former postdoc in the group that published a review paper on top-down and bottom-up techniques to produce nano-sized particles. That was last year, a very interesting paper. So really the challenge in supercritical fluid techniques is instead of scaling up high-pressure reactors from 1 liter, 10 liters, 100 liters, and it's not interesting for the pharma industry. Rather than scaling up, you should scale down and use supercritical CO2 where it needs to exist, using spray drying nozzles, small tubings, which can withstand high pressure. But the majority of the setups should be under atmospheric pressure. So you can scale down, but scale up the product throughput, if that makes sense, using multiple nozzles or tubings and so on. And this is how we we started thinking about this. We started when we were in SSPC phase 1, using high pressure reactors, where we were just using CO2 as an anti-solvent to precipitate drug solution. So we will put a certain amount of solution there of an API, maybe with a polymer dissolved in a certain solvent, CO2, and then it will be closed and pressurized with supercritical CO2 up to a certain pressure that will induce anti-solvent crystallization. Now, scaling up this, it's challenging, so we try to, instead of scaling up, scaling down into a spray drying nozzle. So that means if you have, let's suppose, a 10 milliliters reactor, you scale down to a spray drying nozzle which has a 0.1 milliliters mixing chamber. So that's kind of scaling down 100-fold so 100 times the size of your reactor down to a spray drying nozzle, for instance. And you can, it's a continuous method, you can produce particles over time as much as you want. So this is just an old prototype of our nano spray drying, where you have supercritical CO2 mixing with the drug solution. So they don't necessarily mix here, they mix just at the very tip of the nozzle. They mix, and we can induce anti-solvent supersaturation within the nozzle. So we can nucleate the polymorphic form that we want of the API without crystallizing, without blocking the nozzle. Or we can just use supercritical CO2 as a high-pressure atomizing fluid, just to push out the solution using very tiny nozzles to generate nanoparticles. They will be immediately dried. The challenge is to catch those nanoparticles using highly efficient cyclones, filters. It's very, very challenging if you're producing down to 100 nanometers, 200 nanometers particles. So our yields were all in kind of 5%, 10%, which is not acceptable within, as a kind of a pharma industry standard, for a pharma industry standard. So we tried to develop CM Nano, which is first with the first prototype, which was not continuous, but rather using the spray drying chamber, using still the same spray drying nozzle, but catching those nanoparticles by carrier micron-sized granules. So just going briefly through this. So in our first batch semi-continuous version of this technology, we have supercritical CO2 going from one side, and then our API solution going from the other side. They will mix at within a coaxial nozzle, and we can have the API nucleating here, or we can just use CO2 to spray through the nozzle. So we have high pressure here, and here we have atmospheric pressure. Sometimes it might reach 2 or 3 bar. So what we have here in the middle, we have a steel mesh where we can control the width of these holes over here. And on the top of this mesh, we have carrier particles. We have used MCC, which is micron crystalline cellulose, 100 micrometers particle size, has good flowability, good compressibility, but we can use any other carrier particles which will not dissolve in the solvent which is being sprayed over here. So as spray drying occurs, we generate within a few milliseconds micro droplets, and those micro droplets will supersaturate and dry and generate those drug nanoparticles. We can control the size of those nanoparticles, solid state as well, depending on which API we are using. Solid state by controlling how quick those droplets will dry and what happens here in the nozzle as well, controlling residence time of the CO2 within the with the solvent. Those drug nanoparticles are being dried, and then immediately they are coated onto carrier particles. So here you have, let's say, 200, 300 nanometers size particles, and here you have 50, 100, 200 micrometers carrier particles. And so the flow of the fluids is downwards, right? But over here, since we have this steel mesh, there's some pressure rising up here, up to 2-3 bar. So these carrier particles, which are sitting on top of this steel mesh, in this case MCC, they are kind of, it's not necessarily fluidization, but they are moving around and are being coated by the nanoparticles, because the CO2 has this being pushing downwards. It will create this movement within these carrier particles here. So we coat all the API onto the drug, onto the carrier particles, and then afterwards we will discharge this nanoformulation, which is directly compressible into a tablet. So we published this work last year by Vivek Verma, a former postdoc. He's now currently doing a Marie Curie in Imperial College London. And then we moved from batch semi-continuous into a fully continuous version of this technology, which is slightly different. Here we just use one nozzle. Here we use multiple nozzles, okay? And this technology that we have been developing here, we are further developing, what we have here is we have the carrier granules, the carrier particles. In this case, we have used MCC, being dropped through a funnel over here, right? So they are falling down by gravity from here through here. And through these nozzles over here, we have CO2 with the API solution being sprayed, okay? So we are generating droplets and nanoparticles through these nozzles over here. We don't use them all at once. We have used 2 nozzles on the top, 2 nozzles on the bottom. We have used different angles of the nozzles, and we've changed the position of those nozzles that are being used. And what happens is the carrier particles, they come from here, and as they fall down, they are being coated by the different sprays of the nanoparticles. And we end up here with the carrier particles coated by nanoparticles. And then those are collected in in a drum, and those can be directly compacted into a tablet. So just with this technology, we can actually, considering a typical pharmaceutical manufacturing footprint where you have several unit operations separating crystallization from the finished product, using CM Nano, we can get directly into a tablet as soon as we get the powder out of the equipment. So API solution comes in, and the end powder comes out, which is API with excipient particles directly compressible into a tablet. Or we can blend it with further excipients easily to get the finished product by making use, of the control size of nanoparticles, right? So we improved the dissolution rate of those nanoparticles by controlling particle size, and those are coated onto the carrier particles. So not to stay too long in this presentation, just to mention that we have used 5 API model systems, okay, generic APIs, BCS class 2 and BCS class 4 in our CM Nano, and just some examples of some of those APIs that we have used in our technology. So these data, they were all published last year in the paper in the International Journal of Pharmaceutics. What we have here is just BCS class 2 model APIs, carbamazepine, risperidone, and ketoprofen. They're all coated onto MCC using different loading. So we've used 10% loading, 20% loading. We are currently trying to use 40 and 50% loading of the APIs. So they were coated. You can see here the small particles here. Those are the API. Carbamazepine in this case, risperidone, ketoprofen. On the back, we have granules of MCC with the average particle size of 100 micrometers. We are currently trying to use different grades, different sizes of the granules for the MCC as well, and trying to look into other excipients as well. So going into the sizes that we got in terms of the API nanoparticles, which are coated onto MCC, so those were around 150, 200, 400 nanometers. We could control the polymorphic form that we were getting. For carbamazepine specifically, we were able to get either amorphous, metastable form 1, form 2, or form 3, depending on the conditions within the atomization in the drying chamber or within the nozzle. And then we got specifically pure forms for risperidone and ketoprofen. So this led us to get particles as small as 90 nanometers, controlling polymorphic form, and going from 5% yield in terms of collection of nanoparticles up to 90% yield. So that's a tremendous collection capability by making use of excipient carrier particles within our drying chamber there. Comparing spray drying CM Nano with the traditional nano spray dryer, it's certainly very much an improvement in terms of the yield that we can collect here comparing to Buki nano spray drying. These are just some images in terms of the compressibility of our nanomaterials. So the API coated onto the the carrier particles, MCC. So MCC has typically a very good compressibility profile. So MCC here, it's the blue over here, okay? And red, it's carbamazepine nanoparticles coated onto MCC. Here we have risperidone, MCC. Here is ketoprofen nanoparticles onto MCC. So they all behave very, very well. If we had, we don't have it here represented in the chart, but if we had the API alone nanoparticles, the compressibility will be very, very, very poor. So the nanoformulation behaves similarly as MCC behaves, right? Although the API within the MCC formulation has an improved dissolution rate. So what we see here is just the as-received API model systems, risperidone, carbamazepine, ketoprofen, their dissolution rate in water over time. And the nanoformulations, that is 10% loading of the API onto MCC or 20% loading, the improvement of within the dissolution rate is very much improved, particularly for risperidone as we compare to as received to the nanoformulation there. So just to wrap up, so it's a technology that we are currently developing further and further with a vision to go into a spin-out company, hopefully next year. We're just trying to find the right company that will be interested in taking this technology onwards and collaborating with us. Now, what we can achieve within this technology is quite impressive. We can produce, currently with a multi-nozzle continuous CM nano, we can produce currently 100 grams per hour of the powder. We can get as low as 90, 100 nanometers. We can control polymorphic form as well. We're trying to improve throughput as well and making technology more easy to use. So any questions, any suggestions, any comments, I'll be very happy to answer those.
What are the physical properties like of powders with such small particles? Are they very sticky and very hard to handle?
The particles that we have produced coated onto carrier particles, so the nanoparticles of the API coated onto MCC, they're easy to handle. They're not electrostatic. If you just produce API nanoparticles, you might just collect 5% of you just sprayed, and they're electrostatic. You're not able to blend them with, particularly spray drying nanoparticles. It's not easy to blend them with excipient particles, but with our nanoformulation, they flow very well, they're compressible, so it's easy to handle.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
I've heard of ultrasonic being used to cause cavitation to also create small particles within a spray driver. Have you worked on that at all?
Ultrasonic, yeah. Not sure if Bookie and spray drying, they don't use that, yeah. No, we don't use that with our nozzles. Our nozzles, we use sometimes multi-orifice nozzles, but they're very, very, very small. We never try to use, now we can generate very small nanoparticles, so I suppose that will induce, so the ultrasonics will help to reduce particle size, right? So, but that we can achieve this with this already, so there's no need to implement that further. So, but the challenge is always how to collect. The smaller you go, the more challenging it is to collect those particles. So.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, very good talk. I was wondering, with respect to like polymorphic control, it must be a very energetic process. Does the supercritical CO2 act as kind of an anti-solvent to stabilize the crystal forms?
Yeah, in most cases it doesn't. So in most cases we just use high pressure CO2 because it's a very dense fluid. It just helps, it enhances the atomization. It also has a cooling effect, which in some cases it helps to crystallize. If you compare it with high pressure nitrogen, to get the same density, you have to increase much more the pressure of nitrogen. And nitrogen doesn't have this Joule-Thomson coefficient, which is when it goes from high pressure to atmospheric pressure, nitrogen doesn't lose energy and CO2 does. In most cases for the CM nano, we've just used CO2 in conditions that we knew there was no anti-solvent effect. Because when there is anti-solvent effect, sometimes you get mixture of polymorphs. Now, it's an additional tool for one of the APIs, carbamazepine. We have fully controlled the solid state by playing with any solvent effect. It's a bit more challenging, requires more time, but we can fully use the dissolvent effect to control it. But in these cases here, for the 3 examples I've shown, it's just using CO2 to push out the solution and make these particles as small as possible. So, yeah, thanks.
Sorry, just one
Yeah.
more question. For the scale-up process, have you adapted? For the scale-up process, have you adapted a model with the multi-nozzle process? Have you adapted a model system for the scale-up, or is it through physical experimentation?
You mean multi-orifice nozzle or multi-nozzles?
Yeah, the multi-orifice nozzle.
Yeah. The multi-orifice nozzle, we use it in the, just kind of the batch, the semi-continuous spray dryer. We use it there. We use a nozzle which has 7 holes. So we have, it's still a spray, but in fairness, it's kind of 7 sprays merging together. For the multi-orifice nozzle, which is the CM Nano, which has all those nozzles there, we just use one single nozzle. We're trying to avoid too much complexity, otherwise it's difficult. And we're trying to develop CFT on that as well, to improve geometry and so on. So at the moment, visually, the CM Nano, the continuous version is this size, right? And we're trying to see whether we need to increase the height so that the carrier particles will fall down more slowly, increase resonance time, but we are at that stage. So, okay. No more questions.
Thank you.